Ethan Cole was a fisherman, single father, nobody important. He worked nights at Grayport Harbor, out on the water by 7, back near midnight, home in time to make his 10-year-old daughter breakfast before school. That was his whole life. On the night everything changed, he'd just tied up his boat when a black SUV came tearing out of the East Dock Road, too fast, too late, too much rain. It clipped the guardrail and stopped hard. 2 men jumped out, talking over each other. Then Ethan heard the splash. He went off the dock without thinking. Went under twice. Pulled her up, a woman in an evening gown already sinking. He got her onto the dock and got her breathing. Then she grabbed his wrist and pulled him close. "They want me gone," she whispered. Before he could speak, headlights swept across the dock. A man in a dark coat approached, calm, unhurried, and crouched beside her, wrapping his jacket around her shoulders, murmuring her name like someone weak with relief. Ethan watched her face the entire time. She wasn't looking at the man holding her. She was staring at the water, and her expression wasn't relief. It was the look of someone who already knew exactly how she'd ended up in it. To understand Ethan Cole, you had to understand the harbor at midnight. That was his world. Not the world of press releases and charity galas and men in charcoal coats, but the world of diesel engines and salt-stiffened rope, of hauling nets in the dark and knowing the weather by the way the gulls flew. He'd grown up in Grayport, married Clara here, buried her here 5 years ago, when her heart gave out at 34. He'd stayed because leaving felt like abandoning the last place she'd been real. Clara's coat still hung on the hook by the front door. He hadn't moved it. He told himself he kept forgetting. He was raising Lily alone. She was 10 now, gap-toothed and stubborn, and so much like her mother it sometimes stopped him mid-sentence. Every morning he came home from the water in time to make her breakfast, walk her to school, sleep for a few hours, and do it all again. It wasn't a large life, but it was his, and he had built it carefully, the way you build something you intend to last. The people of Grayport knew him the way you know someone who shows up when it matters, who patches your nets without being asked, who splits the good catch with families who've had a bad week. They called him a good man. He didn't argue with them. What they didn't see was what happened after Lily went to sleep, the way he sat on the back porch and looked at nothing. The way the house, which was the right size for 3, had become very quiet in the way that only houses with 1 parent and 1 child understand. Full enough during the day, and then at night, in that particular way, not quite full enough. He had built a careful, sealed life. Enough room for Lily, enough room for the sea, and no room for anyone else. He had told himself this was wisdom. He was starting to wonder if it was just fear. The knock came just before 6 in the morning. Ethan had been awake for 20 minutes, standing at the kitchen window with a cup of coffee going cold in his hand, watching the storm break apart over the water. He wasn't thinking about the harbor. He was thinking about the woman in the evening gown and the way she'd gripped his wrist like she was drowning in something other than water. When he opened the door, she was standing on his porch. She wore a man's flannel shirt several sizes too large, Thomas's, as it turned out, and had no bag, no phone, no pretense of composure. She looked like someone who had spent 2 hours deciding whether to knock and had finally run out of alternatives. "I didn't know where else to go," she said. Her name was Vivian Lancaster. He found this out over the next 40 minutes, sitting across from her at the kitchen table, while she held her coffee with both hands and told him things in the flat, careful voice of someone who had learned not to expect to be believed. Her father, Elliot Lancaster, founder of Lancaster Holdings, had died 3 weeks ago. She was the primary heir. The board was preparing to strip her of operational control, citing instability. Her fiancé, Marcus Hale, had been pressuring her to sign over her voting shares for months. Her personal lawyer had stopped returning calls 4 days ago. She'd escaped the Lancaster estate before dawn, using the only landline Marcus hadn't thought to monitor, an old phone in the back hallway, to call Thomas, her driver of 12 years. He'd come without question, taken her out through the service entrance, handed her his flannel shirt in the car when she was still shivering in the evening gown, and driven her all the way to Grayport. Before they left the estate, he'd pressed a slip of paper into her hand, with an address written on it. "Everybody at the harbor knows Ethan Cole," he'd said. "If we get separated, go there. Wait." Then he'd dropped her at the end of Ethan's street and idled at the curb until she was through the front door. A termination notice arrived by text before he reached the highway. "And the harbor," Ethan said. "What actually happened last night?" Vivian set down her cup. She looked at the table for a moment, then at him. "Marcus and I argued after the gala. It was at the Maritime Club, 2 buildings east of the main dock. We ended up outside, on the pier, the east section." She paused. "I remember standing at the edge. I remember the water looked very black." Another pause, quieter. "After that, nothing. Until you were pulling me up. You think he pushed you." The exhaustion in her face was the kind that comes not from one bad night, but from months of doubting your own mind, until certainty itself becomes unfamiliar. "I think I've been afraid to answer that question." Before Ethan could respond, he heard the soft slap of bare feet on linoleum. Lily appeared in the doorway in her pajamas, hair catastrophically tangled, regarding the stranger at the table with the unsentimental curiosity of a 10-year-old. "You're the lady from the harbor," she said. "Dad told me he pulled someone out." "He did," Vivian said. Lily thought about this. Then she pulled out a chair and sat down. "Do you want some toast? We make it on Saturdays. Today's Friday, but I think it still counts." Ethan watched his daughter push the bread toward a woman who had arrived with nothing, and felt something loosen in his chest. Small, almost nothing, like a window latch giving way in a room that had been sealed a long time. He went to make more coffee. He didn't say yes or no to any of it. He just made the coffee. In those 4 days, something quiet had begun to happen. Vivian, who arrived with nothing, found ways to be useful. Not grandly, but in the small, continuous way of someone discovering they are capable of ordinary things. She helped sort the morning catch. She learned, with comical difficulty, to light the gas stove. She sat at the kitchen table in the evenings while Lily read aloud from whatever book school had assigned, asking questions that made Lily feel like an expert. She was sharper than she let people see, and kinder than she'd been allowed to be. Ethan noticed both things and said nothing about either. Old Mr. Nam from next door noticed too. He brought soup twice that week, stayed for tea, and by the 3rd visit was teaching Vivian to mend a net with the patient authority of a man who had been doing it for 50 years. Vivian's first attempt was spectacularly wrong. Mr. Nam examined it without expression and said, "Again." She laughed, open, unguarded, the kind of laugh that doesn't know it's being listened to, and started over. Then Marcus arrived. He came alone, which was itself a kind of threat. He found Ethan at the dock and stood at a careful distance that said he was being respectful, while everything else about him said he was simply waiting. "I wanted to thank you personally," Marcus said. His voice carried the practiced warmth of a man who had learned that emotion, performed correctly, was a useful instrument. "What you did that night was extraordinary." He placed an envelope on the dock railing, thick, self-explanatory. "I don't need thanks," Ethan said, not looking up from the nets. "Vivian isn't well." The warmth gave way to something more calibrated, the gravity of a man sharing a difficult truth for someone else's benefit. "She's been receiving treatment for 2 years. She chose it voluntarily, after her father's diagnosis. The stress was real, and she needed help. I'm not saying that to diminish her. I'm saying it because after his death, things have become worse. She loses track of what happened and what I imagined. She needs professional support, not—" He glanced around the harbor. "This." Ethan picked up the envelope, held it, then held it back out. "You dropped this," he said. Something passed through Marcus's eyes, quickly, the way a cloud crosses flat water. Then the warmth returned, a degree cooler than before. He turned to go. At the foot of the ramp he paused, as if struck by an afterthought, and looked toward the beach where Lily was skipping stones with Mr. Nam. "The sea is so unpredictable," Marcus said almost to himself, "especially for children without mothers." He didn't wait for a response. Ethan stood at the dock railing for a long time after the car disappeared. His hands were very still. His jaw was not. By the time he walked back to the house, something had settled in him. Not anger exactly. More like clarity. The thing he'd been trying to avoid had been here since the moment he pulled a woman out of black water and heard her whisper, "They want me gone." He'd understood the words. It had taken him 4 days to understand what they meant. He had a choice: stay on the outside of this, or walk into it. He walked into it. Ray Kowalski had worked harbor security for 15 years and knew every camera angle on the waterfront the way a surgeon knows anatomy. When Ethan came to him the next morning with a specific date and a specific time, Ray didn't ask many questions. He'd seen the black SUV that night. He'd always thought the timing was strange. What he found was stranger. 11 minutes of footage, 11:38 to 11:49 p.m., had been deleted from the primary server. Cleanly, professionally, by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. What they hadn't accounted for was a secondary backup server installed 3 years ago for insurance compliance, running off a separate power circuit in a utility closet, a bureaucratic formality most people had forgotten existed. The deletion had touched the primary system only. The backup footage was poor quality. Rain blurred, low resolution, timestamp burned into the corner. But it showed a black SUV at the east dock at 11:41 p.m., the stretch of pier running directly alongside the Maritime Club. 2 figures near the edge, a dark coat, an evening gown. A movement. 1 figure falling. It also showed Marcus Hale, who had told police he was at the Maritime Club bar when his fiancée fell, confirmed by the head bartender, standing on that dock at 11:41 p.m. He had lied. Ethan brought the drive home and set it on the kitchen table. Vivian looked at it for a long moment. "The bartender will say it's doctored," she said. Her hands were flat on the table. "We need something that stands alongside this, something they can't explain away." "I know someone," Ethan said. "A reporter at the Gazette. Ray gave me her name. He said she'd been digging into Lancaster Holdings for months before any of this happened. I'll talk to her." A week after Marcus's visit to the harbor, the regional papers ran the story he had prepared for them. The headline read, "Lancaster heirs troubled past. Sources close to family raise concerns about mental fitness." It quoted unnamed people. It described her treatment history in language carefully chosen to sound factual and damning simultaneously. It called the harbor incident an alarming episode. Vivian read it the way you read something you already knew was coming, sitting at Ethan's kitchen table, coffee going cold, face very still. By the time it reached Grayport, the story had grown. People who'd waved to Ethan at the fuel dock now looked at him sideways. A woman at the grocery store asked a 10-year-old, if it was true that the lady staying with them had gone crazy. Lily came home, furious, which was how she processed things she didn't know how to carry. That night, Ethan heard a sound from the spare room, not crying, but something quieter and harder. He stood at the door for a moment, then knocked. Vivian was sitting on the edge of the bed with a half-packed bag beside her. She didn't look up. "Every day I stay here, I make your life worse," she said. "Lily's life worse. I didn't ask to be saved, and I didn't ask you to get involved, and I think—" She stopped, started again more carefully. "I think people like me break everything we touch." Ethan leaned against the doorframe. He thought about what to say and decided against most of it. "You whispered 4 words to me in the rain," he said. "I didn't have to jump in. I chose to. That means I chose the rest of it too. That's not how consequences work. Maybe not, but it's how I work. She looked up. Her eyes were very tired and very clear at the same time. She wanted to argue. He could see her deciding not to. From down the hall, "Is Vivian leaving?" Lily's voice flat with the specific worry of a child trying to sound like she isn't worried. Neither of them answered immediately. "No," Ethan said. "She's not." He left. Behind him, he heard the sound of the bag being set down. He stood in the hallway for a moment, one hand on the wall, and thought about the version of himself that had been sitting on the back porch looking at nothing for 5 years, and the version that was standing here now. He wasn't sure yet what the distance between them added up to. He suspected it was more than he'd thought. The following morning, Thomas arrived at the back door with a cardboard box and the look of a man who had been carrying something heavy for a long time. In 12 years of driving for the Lancaster family, Thomas had developed a habit common to people in service. He paid attention. He kept a small spiral notebook, dates, destinations, fragments of overheard conversation that hadn't made sense at the time. And over the past year, when something in him had started to feel wrong about the transfers he drove Marcus to, the meetings that appeared on no official calendar, he had begun photographing documents. Quietly, carefully, before they disappeared into locked briefcases. He'd made copies of everything before his termination, suspecting, correctly, that the day might come. Vivian spread the documents across the kitchen table and read in silence for 40 minutes. When she finished, she set the last page down and sat very still. $42 million, she said. Shell companies in the Caymans and Luxembourg. Over 8 months. She looked at the names on the co-signature lines, Aldrich and Pierce. "Will the board believe it?" Ethan asked. She looked up and something in her face had changed, settled, like ground after rain. The uncertainty that had lived there since the night at the harbor was still present, but behind it now was something else, something older and less fragile. "They'll believe it when I'm the one presenting it." Ethan recognized that voice. He'd heard it occasionally in pieces, usually when she was defending Lily from a bad argument or correcting Mr. Nam's fishing knot technique with quiet precision. He hadn't heard it directed at something this large before. He refilled her coffee and let her work. Sandra Chu had been investigating Lancaster Holdings for the better part of a year. She wrote for the Grayport Gazette, drove a car that had survived several minor disasters, and kept a filing system only she could navigate. 8 months earlier, a mid-level accountant inside the company had brought her evidence of irregular transfers and then gone silent. Reassigned, she suspected, or warned off. She'd kept building from what he'd given her, public financials, board minutes, donation records. When she reached the death of Elliot Lancaster and found a discrepancy between the hospital's public statement and what a cardiologist friend described as the expected clinical picture, she'd written a handwritten letter to Dr. Harlan Webb, a retired physician who'd signed off on an internal review of the case and then abruptly left the hospital 3 months later. She hadn't expected him to respond. He called the Gazette on a Tuesday. That same week, Ethan had reached her through Ray Kowalski. Ray had covered her parking spot at the harbor press lot for 2 years and knew her work. When Ethan explained what he had, Sandra drove to the harbor that evening, sat in Ray's security booth, and watched the backup footage 3 times without speaking. Then she said, "I know someone at the State University's forensic imaging lab. Give me 4 days." She got 3. The lab processed the footage with full chain of custody documentation. She and Ethan drove to the city together the morning of the board meeting, the certified drive in a padded envelope on the back seat. 2 days before that drive, Dr. Webb had sat across from Vivian in Sandra's cramped office and told her about her father. He told her slowly, watching her face. The original toxicology findings had shown digoxin levels significantly above the therapeutic range in a man already on cardiac medication. The conclusion should have been straightforward. But the final report, signed by a senior physician at Lancaster Memorial, an institution the Lancaster family had funded for decades, described the cause of death as acute cardiac failure. Natural causes. Dr. Webb had raised the discrepancy internally. He'd been asked, quietly, to let it go. He had retired 3 months later, taking his original notes with him. When Vivian asked why he'd stayed quiet for so long, he was quiet for a moment himself. "I had a pension," he said, "a wife with medical needs. I told myself there wasn't enough to prove anything." He looked at his hands. "I've had a long time to decide whether I believe that." He set a folder on Sandra's desk. "I kept everything." After he left, Vivian didn't speak for a long time. Ethan sat beside her and didn't try to fill the silence. He thought about what it meant to lose someone and not know why. He thought about Clara, how at least he'd understood, had held the diagnosis in his hands, had known what took her. He thought about what it would mean to find out years later that the story had been different all along. What that would do to a person. He felt something move through him. Not pity, which would have been useless. Something closer to rage, clean and clarifying. "He loved the sea," Vivian said finally. "He used to take me sailing when I was small. I was always afraid of the water. I never told him." "You don't have to do this to fix anything between you," Ethan said. "You do it because it's true." She turned and looked at him, the way she sometimes did, like she was finding something unexpected in a place she'd underestimated. "How are you so certain about things?" she asked. "I'm not," he said. "I'm just certain about this one." Marcus had called the emergency board meeting himself, confident in its outcome. He'd circulated a memo recommending an interim executive committee pending resolution of concerns about the primary heir's capacity. It was a document of remarkable legal precision and complete moral vacancy. He'd arranged the votes. He'd arranged the narrative. He had not arranged for Vivian to walk through the door. She came in while he was mid-sentence. She'd driven up that morning in Sandra's car, wearing a dark suit she'd bought at the only women's clothing shop in Grayport that opened before 8, something Ethan had quietly arranged the day before, slipping the address to her without comment. She'd gone over what she was going to say on the 2-hour drive while Ethan drove, and didn't offer opinions she hadn't asked for, which was one of the things about him she had come to rely on. He dropped her at the entrance. "Do you want me to come in?" he asked. "You'll come in later," she said. "First part is mine." She walked through the lobby alone. Keely was waiting by the elevator, her assistant of 3 years, who had spent the past week fielding questions she wasn't authorized to answer, and had finally, quietly, called Vivian on the number she'd been given at the start of her employment for exactly this kind of emergency. She had a visitor's badge already printed, a copy of the board agenda in her hand, and the particular expression of someone who has made a decision and is done reconsidering it. Vivian clipped on the badge without breaking stride. 23 people looked up when she entered the boardroom. Marcus stopped talking. She set her portfolio on the table and looked around the room. "My name is Vivian Lancaster," she said. "I am the primary heir of this company, the daughter of its founder, and the largest individual shareholder. I understand there are concerns about my mental fitness. I'd like to address that directly." She told them the truth about herself first, before the accusations, before the evidence. She told them she'd sought psychiatric treatment after her father's diagnosis because she was frightened and grieving, and because asking for help is what people do when they're in pain. She told them she had battled depression and was still battling it, in the ordinary daily way that millions of people do, including statistically several people in that room. She told them she had never made a business decision she couldn't defend. "The document you've been asked to vote on," she said, "was drafted by a man who has been systematically removing assets from this company for 8 months. She looked at Aldrich, then at Pierce. "With help." She laid Thomas's documents on the table. Ethan had been waiting in the corridor with the certified drive in his jacket pocket, when Keeley opened the boardroom door and nodded at him. He walked in during the silence that follows a statement no one knows how to respond to yet. He'd never been in a room like this, a table that probably cost more than his boat, floor-to-ceiling windows, men in suits watching him cross the carpet with the particular attention of people deciding how to categorize him. He set up the laptop Sandra had configured, connected it to the display system, and pulled up the footage. Ray's recovered backup, processed by the University Forensic Lab, chain of custody intact and documented, sharpened now in the places that mattered. The East Dock. The rain. 11:41 p.m. The stretch of pier alongside the Maritime Club. Two figures near the edge. A dark coat, an evening gown, a movement. One figure falling. He let it run without comment. Marcus had been managing his expression throughout Vivian's presentation with visible effort. The performance of a man accustomed to controlling rooms, now watching a room slip its leash. As the footage played, the composure didn't break so much as drain. Slowly, like water finding a crack it had always known was there. When the video ended, Ethan closed the laptop. The room was very quiet. Marcus leaned forward in his chair, jaw tight. Something underneath the control finally surfacing. Not calculation now, but the thing calculation had always been covering. Harbor footage from a rainy night proves nothing, he said. His voice had shed all warmth. You drove 2 hours to show them blurred images. This man has no standing in this room. He doesn't belong here. He looked at the board. He looked at Ethan. And then, perhaps because there was nothing left to reach for, he said the thing he actually believed. He's a fisherman. He doesn't know his place. Those words landed in the room like something irretrievable. In the silence that followed, Ethan looked at Marcus Hale. The perfect suit, the rigid face, the absolute certainty of a man who had always believed that money and worth were the same thing, and felt something he hadn't expected. Not anger, but a profound quiet. Like water after a storm has passed and the surface has gone completely still. We're done here, Ethan said, and turned back to his laptop. 2 board members voted to suspend Marcus pending investigation before Ethan finished packing up the equipment. 3 more followed before he reached the door. Men like Marcus don't become irrational when they lose. They become differently rational, calculating from a narrower set of options, faster, with the specific focus of someone trying to demonstrate that they still have power over something. The evidence was already distributed. Sandra had copies, Vivian had copies. The board had Thomas's documents in their hands. The drive was worthless to him now. What Marcus wanted, Ethan understood later, was not the drive. It was to prove that he could still make someone afraid. Ethan was halfway to the parking structure when his phone rang. Mr. Nam's number. He'd asked the old man, 2 days ago before driving to the city, to keep an eye on the harbor. If a man in a dark coat shows up, Ethan had said, don't approach him. Call the harbor police first, then call me. Mr. Nam had listened without questions and said simply, okay. Now his voice on the phone was calm and precise. A man in a suit had arrived at the harbor 30 minutes ago. He was on the Clara May. Lily was with him. She appeared unharmed. Did you call the harbor police? Ethan asked. Before I called you, Mr. Nam said. The drive back was the longest 2 hours of Ethan's life. The harbor was quiet in the late afternoon, the storm long gone, the water flat and silver gray. Ethan parked at the road and walked the rest of the way. He made himself walk at a normal pace. He had learned in the past month that the thing you show on your face is the thing other people use to calibrate their next move, and he had nothing to give Marcus to calibrate with. Marcus was on the Clara May, standing in the stern with Lily in front of him. Not restrained, just positioned with the unmistakable deliberateness of a man using a child as a variable in an equation. He was still wearing the boardroom suit. It looked wrong against the ropes and salt-bleached wood, like a language being spoken in the wrong country. Lily stood with her arms crossed and her jaw set, refusing to look scared even when she was. Clara's jaw, Clara's stubbornness, but Lily's own, entirely, irrevocably hers. Ethan stopped at the top of the gangplank. "I want the original drive," Marcus said. The calmness of someone negotiating from habit, even now. "You give me that, I leave. Nobody gets hurt." "You know copies exist," Ethan said. "You were in that room." A flicker crossed Marcus's face, the last calculation arriving at a number that didn't work. Then something simplified behind his eyes. The math was gone. Only the need remained. "Then give me something," he said. "Anything, just—" He stopped. His jaw tightened. "Give me something." Ethan looked at his daughter. Lily looked back. Something passed between them, the wordless language of people who have lived together in a small house for 5 years, who know each other's breathing and the exact weight of each other's silences. "I'm okay," her eyes said. "Don't give him anything," her jaw said. "Lily," Ethan said, "come up here." "She stays until—" "She comes up first," Ethan said. "That's the only deal I'm making." A moment stretched. Marcus looked at him and found perhaps that the remaining options numbered exactly 0. He stepped aside. Lily walked up the gangplank without hurrying. She stopped beside her father and leaned back against his hand when he placed it on her shoulder. A small, certain motion, like something finding its footing. At the top of the dock ramp stood Mr. Nam. Beside him, 2 harbor police officers in rain gear, who had been there for the past 20 minutes, waiting for Ethan's signal. Mr. Nam had stationed himself at the dock entrance the moment he'd made the calls, watching with the quiet patience of a man who has spent 40 years on this waterfront and knows that sometimes the only job is to stay. Marcus heard the footsteps on the planks behind him. He turned. It was over. 6 months is enough time for most things to settle into their permanent shape. Marcus Hale was indicted on 4 counts: attempted murder, first-degree murder, financial fraud, and kidnapping. The forensic documentation accompanying the video footage, chain of custody intact, university certified, held up under every challenge his defense team raised. Aldrich and Pierce took plea agreements within a week, providing testimony in exchange for reduced sentences. Dr. Webb's original notes were authenticated and entered into evidence. Thomas testified for 3 days and did not waver once. The Maritime Club's head bartender, confronted with the footage timestamp placing Marcus on the pier at 11:41 p.m., revised his statement. Sandra Chu's 4-part investigation ran in the Grayport Gazette and was picked up by 14 regional papers. The accountant who had gone quiet 8 months earlier eventually came forward. He had spent that time quietly gathering additional documentation he'd been too frightened to share before. His materials formed the backbone of her follow-up series. She was nominated for 2 journalism awards and spent exactly 3 days acknowledging it before starting her next story. Vivian Lancaster formally assumed operational control of Lancaster Holdings on a Tuesday morning in the same boardroom, with Keeley at her right hand. The first initiative she announced was the Elliott Lancaster Foundation, mental health access and coastal youth programs. When a reporter asked how she planned to address her psychiatric history as it related to her leadership capacity, she said, "By continuing to receive treatment, continuing to lead, and demonstrating that those 2 things are not in conflict." She smiled. Next question. Thomas became head of internal security. He requested specifically that his title not include the word driver. Lily stopped being the girl whose dad was mixed up with the crazy rich lady and became, in the particular social economy of a 10-year-old's world, the girl who had stood on a boat and not flinched. This mattered more to her than she would admit to anyone except Vivian, who she told everything. It was a Friday evening in late October when Vivian stood at the end of Grayport Pier and watched the Clara May come in. She'd driven up without calling ahead. She did this sometimes now, when the city became loud in a particular way that no amount of quiet inside a building could fix. Grayport was an hour and 40 minutes and an entirely different atmosphere. She kept a room at the inn on Cutter Street and was honest with herself, mostly, about why she came. Ethan saw her from the water. He didn't wave, just adjusted course slightly, aiming for the dock where she was standing, and by the time he'd tied up and climbed onto the pier, she was already holding the end of a line without being asked. She'd learned that the same way she'd learned everything here, by watching, and then just doing it. They walked back along the pier in the last of the light. The water was calm and dark and smelled like everything Ethan had known his whole life. "You still think you don't belong in my world?" Vivian asked. She wasn't looking at him. She was watching the horizon, where the last of the sun was making its slow exit. "I never said that." "You thought it." He was quiet for a moment. The boards of the pier were familiar under his boots. Every warped plank, every salt-bleached nail. He'd walked this dock 10,000 times. He wondered when it had started to feel different. "Maybe," he said. "Not anymore." She glanced at him. The look on her face was the particular one of someone receiving something they'd quietly stopped expecting. Not quite surprise, and more than relief. From the beach came the sound of Lily, chasing Mr. Nam's dog in wide, shrieking circles across the wet sand, catastrophically failing to catch it, and apparently delighted by this. Vivian watched her and laughed, the full kind, unguarded, the kind that has no architecture to it and doesn't know it's being listened to. Ethan watched Vivian laugh. Clara's coat still hung on the hook by the front door. He hadn't moved it. But sometime in the last 6 months, without quite deciding to, he had stopped thinking of it as the last of something and started thinking of it as what it was, a coat. Something that had belonged to someone he loved, something he could keep and still walk forward. He didn't say any of this out loud. There was nothing that needed saying, and he had learned, somewhere in these last 6 months, that the things that are true don't require explanation. They just require time and the willingness to stay. The sun went down over Grayport Harbor. The Clara May rocked gently at the dock. Lily caught the dog finally and held it up in triumph. "Wow, what an incredible journey we just went on together." First of all, I want to take a moment to say a massive thank you to everyone who stayed until the very end of this story. Thank you for listening, for engaging, and for sharing your time with me today. Stories like this, stories about quiet dignity, misplaced authority, and the unbreakable bond between a parent and a child, really resonate with us because they touch on the very core of what it means to be human in a corporate world. If you are just letting the dust settle from that incredible ending at the spelling bee, grab a cup of coffee or tea, sit back, and let's unpack everything that just happened. We are going to dive deep into a summary of the events, analyze the profound lessons hidden within the narrative, and discuss why Julian Vance is the exact type of leader the world needs more of right now. Let's quickly recap the brilliant sequence of events that just unfolded. Our story opens in a high-stakes, tense corporate boardroom. Eleanor Price, a newly hired numbers-obsessed COO, is preparing for a massive presentation with the Apex delegation. In the back of the room sits Julian, a seemingly ordinary junior data analyst. But Julian is wearing something extraordinary, a cheap pink rhinestone butterfly clip on his lapel. To Eleanor, this is a violation of her strict, optics-driven version of professionalism. She publicly fires him on the spot. Julian doesn't yell. He doesn't argue. He simply touches the clip, a promise to his daughter, and walks out in silence. But here is the twist that Eleanor didn't know. Julian Vance isn't just an analyst. He is the founding shareholder, the creator of the company's core architecture. and the chairman of the board. He built the company from his kitchen 7 years ago. So why was he working as a junior analyst? Following the tragic passing of his wife 3 years prior, Julian willingly stepped down from his executive duties to ensure he could leave work at 6 every evening to raise his young daughter Maya. The butterfly clip was her mother's, and Maya pinned it on him that morning so they could be brave at the same time for her spelling bee. The climax hits when the Apex delegation arrives. Eleanor tries to launch the demo, but the system locks her out because HR terminated Julian's account, and the system's security protocol automatically froze everything tied to the foundational architecture which Julian wrote. When Eleanor orders Thomas, a hardworking junior employee whom Julian had quietly mentored late at night, to bypass the system, Thomas reveals the truth to the room. He tells them exactly who Julian is. Eleanor, realizing her mistake, tries to spin the narrative, accusing Julian of being manipulative by hiding his identity, and tries to rally the employees against him. Instead, Thomas stands up, places his badge on the table, and quits. He is quickly followed by several others. They don't care about Julian's hidden wealth. They care that Julian was the man who stayed with them until 2 in the morning to fix code when no one else would. Julian returns, unlocks the system, and pulls up data proving that Eleanor's management style was toxic, rewarding sycophants while punishing actual hard workers. The CFO confirms Eleanor had no legal authority to fire Julian. In 4 swift sentences, Julian terminates Eleanor for cause. He saves the Apex deal, promotes Thomas, and leaves to do the most important thing on his schedule: watch his daughter win her spelling bee, with the pink butterfly clip still proudly pinned to his lapel. There is so much to learn from this narrative. We see a stark contrast in leadership styles. Eleanor represents a very common, toxic form of modern management. She cares about the appearance of professionalism over the substance of the work. To her, a pink hair clip was a threat to the company's image. She measured success by who agreed with her and who looked the part. Julian, on the other hand, represents true leadership. Leadership isn't a title, it's an action. Julian was a leader when he was the CEO, but he was equally a leader when he sat down next to a struggling junior employee in the middle of the night to help debug a system. True leaders remove friction for their teams. They don't create it. This story also highlights the danger of assumptions and ego. Eleanor made a fatal mistake. She didn't ask questions about people she deemed irrelevant. Because Julian had no fancy title on his door and didn't boast about his wealth, she assumed he had no power. She let her ego blind her to reality. Never judge a person's value by their title, their office size, or their quiet demeanor. The most dangerous person in the room is rarely the loudest. It is usually the one who is quietly collecting data, watching, and understanding how everything works from the ground up. Think about the most powerful moment in the boardroom. It wasn't when the CFO revealed Julian's legal status. The most powerful moment was when Thomas put his badge on the table, followed by Priya, and then the others. Why did they resign for a man they thought was just a junior analyst? Because Julian gave them his time, his empathy, and his respect when they were struggling. When you treat people like human beings, you build a foundation of loyalty that no corporate hierarchy can break. Ultimately, Julian's story is about knowing what truly matters. He built a multi-million-dollar empire, yet he realized that none of it mattered if he couldn't be there for his little girl. Stepping down from being CEO to be a present father was the ultimate display of strength. In a culture that glorifies the hustle and working endless hours, Julian's choice reminds us that our jobs will never love us back. The only people who will remember that you worked late are your kids. Julian wore a plastic pink butterfly clip into a room of executives because keeping a promise to a scared 7-year-old was infinitely more important than the opinions of people in gray suits. As we wrap up today's video, I want to leave you with this thought. Are you an Eleanor, caught up in the optics and the ego? Or are you a Julian, quietly doing the work, supporting the people around you, and remembering what actually matters when you go home at the end of the day. I hope this story inspired you as much as it inspired me. We need more butterfly clips in the boardroom. We need more empathy in our workplaces. And we need to remember that sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one who built the whole building. If this story touched your heart, if it made you think about your own career, your family, or how you treat your coworkers, please do me a huge favor. Hit that like button right now. It really helps the channel grow and pushes these positive, meaningful stories out to more people who might really need to hear them today. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell. We have so many more incredible stories and deep dives coming your way, and I don't want you to miss a single one. Before you go, drop a comment down below. I want to hear from you. What was your absolute favorite moment in this story? Was it Thomas putting his badge on the table? Was it the Apex director signing the deal? Or was it Maya adjusting the clip at the spelling bee? Let me know in the comments. I read every single one. Thank you all again from the bottom of my heart for spending your time with me today. Keep working hard, keep supporting the people around you, and never be afraid to wear your own pink butterfly clip. I'll see you in the next video.